are following a major developing story in the auto world this morning. Fiat Chrysler and French carmaker Renault are teaming up to create the world's third biggest car company. Shares of both automakers are soaring on this news. Fiat shares up by close to 5%. Renault shares up by more than 10% this morning. Phil LeBeau joins us right now with more on this. Phil, good morning.
Becky, this would be a huge deal if it comes together. The negotiations picked up speed over the last couple of weeks, and especially within the last week. That's when John Elkann, who is the head of the Agnelli family, which is the controlling shareholder in Fiat Chrysler, started talking quite a bit with the CEO or the chairman of Renault. And as they started talking, this is the deal that was put together. Officially, it is Fiat proposing this merger. But let's be clear, the two sides have been talking. This is not like Fiat came out of the blue and said, hey, interested in getting together? It would be a 50-50 merger. The management structure to be determined, although Jean-Dominique Senard, who is the chairman of Renault, would be considered CEO, and John Elkann would be chairman of the company. At least that's the idea at this point. Annual sales, 8.7 million vehicles worldwide. That makes them, or would make them, the third largest automaker in the world. So in terms of investors, why does this deal make sense? Why would you look at this and say, hey, good idea putting these two companies together? You get $5.6 billion in cost savings. That's the estimate, at least on paper, from Fiat Chrysler. There's little geographic overlap. Yes, they're both in Europe, but the areas where they are strongest and the product markets that they play in Europe, they don't really overlap as much as you would think. $8.9 billion in net profit in 2018. So as you take a look at, we're going to show you three stocks to watch here. First of all, let's start off with Renault. And when it comes to Renault, keep in mind that the board is now reviewing this merger proposal. We expect that it won't be long before we hear something from the board in terms of whether or not they believe this should go forward to shareholders. Then take a look at Fiat Chrysler. The shareholders at Fiat Chrysler, by the way, so they can make the valuations match here, they will be sharing in a $2.8 billion one-time special dividend. So for many Fiat Chrysler shareholders, they will get part of that dividend, that $2.8 billion. And finally, take a look at shares of Nissan. And the reason we're showing this to you is because Nissan Renault are part of an alliance where you've got Renault owning 43% of Nissan, and Nissan's stake in Renault, which is currently 15%, guys, it would be cut in half, drop down to 7.5%. So for Nissan, to a certain extent, they're boxed in here. They are not crazy about doing a full merger with Renault. That was the vision of Carlos Ghosn. That's part of the reason many people believe that the situation that developed over the last 6 months with Carlos Ghosn and Nissan executives and Japanese authorities, that's one of the factors that many people believe caused that situation, with him being arrested and charged with a number of financial crimes that he denies. So what does Nissan do from here, guys? Because they don't want a full merger, yet at the same time, if they don't go forward with one, their influence on Renault, especially if it's a merged Fiat Chrysler Renault, it would be diminished dramatically.
Hey, Phil, though, see, to me, and I spent a lot of time over the weekend on the phone about this transaction, it seems to me that on the Nissan piece, which I think is actually the most interesting piece, especially, by the way, given that Trump was over in Tokyo, and apparently there were some conversations behind the scenes. President Trump was over in Tokyo. That it cuts both ways, in that Nissan was always upset about how much power the French government had vis-a-vis Renault. And by entering into this transaction, the French government effectively gets diluted. Yes, Renault, Fiat Chrysler Renault, if you will, becomes a larger component. But in terms of the ownership structure, in terms of government, in terms of a government stake, that changes. No?
You're correct that that does change, that the French government does not have as much influence on the Nissan-Renault alliance.
But wasn't that always one of the biggest points of contention?
Well, it was a huge point of it was a huge point of contention. A secondary point of contention was the feeling that Carlos Ghosn and the people that who worked closely with him, it was not a Japanese corporation. It was a French company that worked with them. And as a result, increasingly, you could tell that there was strain from the Japanese perspective, that it was not losing control of the company, but that its influence was not as great as it should
What
be.
was yours?
This would mean it was even less of a Japanese corporation, that they would have even
Correct.
less impact. So is that a good thing from their perspective or a bad thing?
I think in the grand scheme of things, given how upset they seem to be about the French role.
Yeah, but that seems like it could be
that now that it gets effectively
a red herring.
Given
so
the
to speak.
state of where
If they're-
Nissan is, I'd be surprised. I'm surprised that they're upset, except for the fact that I think that some of them thought that it was being done behind their back, right, Phil?
Yes, yeah, you're right on all those points, Andrew. The other thing to keep in mind, however, if you're Nissan, things have not gone well. Take a look at that chart. That just is symbolic of what's going on with this company over the last 6 months. Ever since the Ghosn affair exploded, they have had a rocky time in terms of the financials that they've posted, and this is a company that is in many ways at a crossroads. I'm talking strictly Nissan. I'm not talking Nissan Renault. Strictly Nissan is at a crossroads. Whether you're looking in the United States, whether you're looking in Japan or in other markets in Asia, this is a company that it needs direction and it needs people to take control of it. And there is a feeling that that is what's lacking right now.
All right, well, look, shareholders are pushing that up. It's up 2.3% today. So shareholders like the initial news on this. What about management there?
Oh, they won't like that. Because
they weren't part of this, right?
No, they won't like it. And you know, now look, they might ultimately sit there and say, we would be the world's largest alliance worldwide, $15 billion in sales annually. But Nissan's component within that is going to be less, a smaller percentage than before.
Right. Hey, Phil, and then the last piece of this is one of the pledges that's been made, and this is, to me, the big political or regulatory hurdle, both in France and elsewhere, is this pledge by Fiat Chrysler that they won't be closing plants, that they won't be losing jobs, that all of the synergies and value will come from the ability to, basically collect the supply chain so that they'll be able to get lower fees for different product, et cetera. Is that realistic?
No, it's not as realistic as they're portraying it on paper. First of all, let's talk about no job losses. That means you're not going to close any plants. There's too much capacity, too much auto capacity in Europe. And that's not just Renault and Fiat. That's all automakers. There's too much capacity there. That has to be stripped out of the system. While Renault has done some of that over the last 15 years, not as much as many people believe should be done.
If that's true, do you believe the French government will ultimately approve this deal?
Oh, they will if they get those guarantees. They'll say, well, if you're guaranteeing it, I think that we ultimately will agree to this deal. And in terms of your second point, Andrew, we hear this all the time whenever there is an alliance, a partnership, a merger within the auto industry. We're going to save X billion dollars. Never happens. Never happens. They will make some savings, but if a company says we're going to save $3 billion, we know that those synergies there on paper. Rarely does it happen. Comes out maybe at like $2.5 billion. And that's not to say that they're going to not save some money here. They will if this deal comes together. But the $5.6 billion, I think a lot of people look at that and say, okay, you're going to get some of those savings. You're not going to get all of that savings.